Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. You know, everybody has their own standards for what constitutes a special Phish show. A killer setlist, monster jams, rarities, meeting up with old friends, making new friends, going to your hometown venue, and more. I mean, that's the entire premise of this podcast. But every now and again, Phish plays a show that is an undisputed special show. A show that encapsulates all of the above and maybe even a little more. Today's episode with guest Chris Bojar revisits such a show from the recent past, July 14th, 2019 at Alpine Valley in East Troy, Wisconsin. There can be little doubt that Phish has a special affinity for the Summertime Shed, as they've played several great shows there. However, few shows are as explicit as this one, where the band went out of their way to tell the crowd how much they love playing at Alpine Valley, both directly and through goofy antics and banter, including a breakout version of Ruby Waves, Iculus, and putting the pressure on a certain couple to get married. Throw in the fact that Chris is from Wisconsin and was able to have a buddy's weekend at the height of summer. The table is set for an all-time great show, and boy did Phish deliver. So let's join Chris to talk about planning set lists, Spock's brain, and getting harassed by Kentucky police as we discuss July 14th, 2019 at Alpine Valley. Chris, welcome to Attendance Bias. How are you?
I'm doing great. How you doing, Brian?
I'm doing well, thank you. Today, we are here to discuss what I think could fairly be called a modern masterpiece of a Phish show. I know those are heavy words, but I think it's a show that's very well known. I think that there are parts of it that are very well known, and I'm surprised that no one else chose it. So thank you. We are talking today about July 14th, 2019 at Alpine Valley, Wisconsin, a venue that I've never been to. So I'm excited to hear about what the vibe was like at the show, although I think I could hear it pretty well through the audience recording. Chris, I'm excited to talk about it with you. You excited to talk about Alpine Valley 7/14/19?
For sure. Pumped to talk about it. Thanks for having me on.
Sure. Would you agree with that phrase, modern masterpiece?
Yeah, it's tough because I think Phish always, sets a higher bar and a higher bar. But in some ways, the older shows, I think, get more credence, or over time, it ages better. So it's almost like, oh, well, did you see that great, baseball game last week, right? Well, that great baseball game last week, 5 years later, all of a sudden it becomes better. And then 25 years later, it becomes even better. So yeah, I would agree with you.
But before we get into 7/14/2019, let's hear about Chris as part of the Attendance Bias Lightning Round.
Attendance Bias Lightning Round.
Chris, when was your first Phish show and what do you remember about it?
So my first Phish show was Saturday, February 22nd, 2003. It was in Cincinnati, Ohio at US Bank Arena. I actually came into the show a little nervous because we missed a turn and almost missed the start of the show. So we went over the river, and I don't know, have you been to Cincinnati before?
Yeah, I was at this show.
It was funny because we went over the river, and in sort of a panic, we pulled over and a cop came over to our car, and we're telling him we're trying to get to the US Bank Arena to go to see Phish. And he's screaming at us, "You're in the wrong state." And, it's Kentucky, right? I mean, it's across the river. My wife's from Dayton, Ohio. So we've been to a bunch of Reds games. I actually went to a wedding at the museum there between the two stadiums. But anyways, it was one of those things where we were a little flustered. And, obviously the cop was having a little bit of fun with us. But the memories from the show, I do remember distinctly because we had seats. At set break, we went to use the bathroom. And I didn't know the guy next to me. And I turned to him and I was like, "Is this how it always goes?" And he's like, "Yeah, man, this is Phish." And it was like, oh boy, and that was sort of, I was hooked from that point right there.
Well, what didn't you know? Did you not know that there was a set break?
No, I knew there was a set break. I didn't realize that it could be any song. They could be played as whatever lengths. I mean, I'd heard Phish a bunch before, but I hadn't actually been to a concert, obviously. And so when you hear it live the first time, it's just, it's one of those things that it either sticks or it doesn't. Because we've actually had some shows where we tried to bring friends that weren't Phish fans, and it's been with mixed results, and that's totally fine. I'm a soccer fan, and for a while I always thought I had to convince people to be soccer fans, and I'm now realizing if you like soccer, you like soccer. If you don't, you don't. same thing with Phish. If you're into it, great. And I'd like to foster that with people that might not know about it, but I also don't want to force it down people's throats, right? Because I
Of
think
course.
some of that leads to people sort of pushing back on that.
Yeah, yeah. You're not even dealing with musical taste at that point. You're more dealing with a personality. And that could
Exactly.
go wrong. But that show, I could understand you getting flustered because that was a rainy, cold night. Also,
Yep.
if you remember.
That's a great memory. Yeah. Yep.
Yep, and they opened with the sloth. Like that was an outstanding show. Those of you listening, if you haven't listened to February 22nd, and I also, for a long time, I went to both nights. They played the night before also in Cincinnati. For a long time, I was a bigger fan of the 21st. I like the set list a little bit better, but the playing on the 22nd is better. That bathtub gin, talk about modern marvels. I mean, that will live in infamy, that bathtub gin. Fabulous.
Yep. And and then I think, Friday takes some heat, right?
Yeah,
But
the Friday encore.
the Friday they sort of play into that and you're like, oh man. But it is funny. There's always that regret of like, oh, I didn't go to this show or I went to that show or whatever it was. And I think you're correct that maybe the night before people thought that might have been a better night. But yeah, great show and excited to do it. And funny enough, I walked by there. Like I said, my in-laws live in Dayton, Ohio. So we go to baseball games at Great American Ballpark. So I love walking by the entrance to US Bank Arena because I always think about, that was my first show and it's just exciting. And you sort of transported back to 20 years ago or whatever. So great memories for sure.
What was your most recent show and what did you think of it?
Well, my most recent show was New Year's this year. And I just feel blessed that I got to go to the show. If we're talking about modern marvels or what was the term you used? Sorry.
Modern masterpiece.
Modern masterpieces. I assume 12/31/23 is the modern masterpiece. Is that how that's going to go?
I think that I said the next day that I reached the summit of a mountain I've been climbing for 25 years, 26 years, whatever it is. And I don't know how to get down. Like there's nowhere to go but down. That's how I felt in the immediate aftermath. Talk about attendance bias. I thought that I had seen all there is to see after this past New Year's. Yeah.
I had never been to MSG before, and we went to this New Year's run because my buddy turned 40. So we actually, left our respective families, wives, kids, for all of us to meet up in New York and go to the shows. And we were planning it. His birthday was the 30th. So we were definitely going to go to the 30th. And so if we're going to go to the 30th, we got to go to the 31st. If we're going to go to the 31st, we might as well go to the 29th. The only show we didn't catch was the 28th. Too bad, but great to catch those 3 shows in a row. And they had a great crew that they hang out with. And we would, at set breaks, we'd all go meet up. And it was funny because it almost felt like it was sort of building. I think if people love to, rank shows and say whatever they like, it seems like the 30th people might have thought that was the worst of the 4 of the run. And it doesn't, it's sort of neither here nor there. But meeting up between the 2 set breaks on the 31st, there was some excitement thinking we might see something great after the first set break. We didn't know. When the second set broke, Trey said, well, why don't you guys come back for some more? Man, we all ran to meet up and it was like, we had seen something amazing and we're high-fiving and hugging. And this was a bunch of people I actually didn't know before this run of shows. So obviously my friend and his cousin were the 2 people that I hung with the most and have known them a long time, but the rest of the crew I didn't know. And you would have thought we were best friends for life based on getting together and hugging it out and smiling about it. So it was great.
Phish playing Gamehenge on New Year's Eve at Madison Square Garden. The moment they start that Man Who Stepped Into Yesterday guitar riff, you would everyone around you is your best friend. All of a sudden, there's only joy to be had by every single person. It was such a great feeling.
It's funny when I come into work now. So I commute, maybe 3 days a week. I come downtown. I live in Chicago. We moved out to the burbs maybe 6 months ago. If I have one of those mornings where I'm not feeling great, when I get off the train, I get to walk down the Chicago River towards my office, and I'll throw on The Man Who Stepped Into Yesterday, and I'll still kind of get those like weird tinglies, but it's a nice pick me up. Yeah. So
yeah, and they played it at the show we're going to talk about today. We're not there yet, but we have more to discuss. Going from probably the highest peak, I would imagine almost anyone who is at that show has felt at a Phish concert. Let's get a little bit more grounded. What is your most controversial Phish opinion?
Yeah, and I don't even know if this is controversial. You tell me. And this happened actually in the show that we're going to talk about. But if you're going to a run of a Friday through Sunday, which is usually how it goes when Phish plays at Alpine, which is, where I've seen them the most. If they play a tweezer on Friday or Saturday, I'm oddly disappointed because I know what's going to finish on Sunday, and I think the beauty of Phish, right, is that you don't know what's going to happen. Like you've signed up for this. Please play songs I haven't heard of. In fact, I went back and just sort of ran the stats and looked at it in the show we're going to talk about. I think there were 6 songs I've never seen besides that show, and in some ways, it might take me a little while to even realize what I'm listening when the song comes on. But I think that's part of the fun, since almost everything that we do is predictable and there's sort of no, real surprises. So I don't know. You tell me, is that a controversial take to say that when they play Tweezer, Tweezer Reprise is coming at the end of the weekend?
I don't know about controversy, but a little bit of really skimming the top of being annoyed, where it's like, are you really complaining that they're going to play Tweezer Reprise, arguably the best 4 or 5 minutes in modern rock and roll? Even if you know that it's coming, it's nice to have it coming.
For sure. No, it's a fair point.
Yeah, I don't think it's controversial though. I just think it's an opinion. I've had much worse controversial opinions on here. What is the weirdest thing though that you've ever seen at a Phish show?
I saw the failed Harpua. And maybe that's being aggressive to say it, but what I think is considered the failed Harpua from July 21st, 2013. So the quick background is that I think Phish, they hung out with members of Second City, and oddly enough, one of my friends, his wife is currently in the Second City cast. So we're going to see her in a couple of weeks, which is going to be super exciting. But Phish hung out with the Second City cast and said, you know what, why don't we try the Harpua gag? And it went on for a while and it just didn't quite land. And I don't know if it's because the night before was a mega long concert, because the Friday, that was the Sunday show that I'm talking about. The Friday show actually got cut short. So in the second song of the second set, they actually stopped the show because it was, I think they call it Huntington Beach, but it's in downtown Chicago. So it was an old airport. So it's almost in the lake. And we were just getting rain sideways. And then lightning came. So they canceled the Phish show that Friday night. Ironically, Pearl Jam was playing at Wrigley Field, and my wife saw Sheryl Crow at Ravinia. So she loves to give me heat that Sheryl Crow played through the rain. Now, they didn't have lightning up there, but Sheryl Crow played through it. Actually, Pearl Jam ended up paying a pretty significant fine that Friday night because they were told to get off at Wrigley and not play anymore. And then they came back at about midnight. So we were on my friend's rooftop deck listening to Pearl Jam play that Friday night, which was super cool. But there's rules around what time you can play, and there's a lot of negotiation on that. So I think they got in trouble for that, but they were happy to pay it. But so I don't know if it was that people were just sort of disappointed from that Friday show getting cut short, and then they had a longer show to make up for it on Saturday. But that Sunday, the Harpua didn't completely land, and like anything with Phish, I was happy to be there for it. It was something different.
Well, today's show, July 14th, 2019, let's take a look back at the summer 2019 tour. So by the numbers, they played 24 shows on the 2019 summer tour. They began with a pair of shows in St. Louis. They went back to Bonnaroo afterward to headline. They played a single show in Toronto, went to the Midwest to Cleveland for a single show at Blossom, and then they cut east to Charlotte, 2 shows at Merriweather, north to Bangor, Maine, and then 3 shows in Camden. So they were all over the place. If you were trying to old school tour with Phish, you put a lot of miles on your car and you had to buy a lot of gas this summer. But for a while after Camden, the tour wasn't over. They moved up to SPAC, 2 shows at Mohegan Sun, which were my only 2 shows of that summer. And then they wrapped up with these 3 shows at Alpine Valley. And then, of course, the Labor Day run at Dick's, which, talk about controversial Phish opinions, ask someone if they think Dick's is part of the summer tour. What do you say?
Yeah, I don't think it's part of the summer tour. What do you think?
I think it is. I think it caps the summer tour.
Okay.
What I remember from this tour, and I'm curious if you agree with this or disagree or what your experience was like, is that people who streamed the shows from home were kind of lukewarm toward the playing, whereas people who were in attendance for the show were ecstatic. And they were saying after every night that was the best show of tour. Like, people who went were raving. I mean, it was attendance bias in its purest form. That people who went to the shows were raving, but people who were at home, whether it was the official stream or an unofficial stream, were kind of making fun of the set lists. Oh, you got more Ghosts of the Forest tunes. Trey Ripcord did that jam, and so on. But at Mohegan Sun, I understood completely because I enjoyed both of the shows. It seemed that the feeling in the room created almost a depth, like in the sound in the room, I guess I should say. There was like a depth to it that it's impossible to replicate through a soundboard recording. Even if you listen back to it now on soundboard, you can't really capture how it felt to be there and the dynamics that Phish, the band, was playing with. Not just dynamics in certain parts of a song are loud, certain parts of a song are low, but the way they were interacting with each other. And then all of a sudden they would just kind of gel out of nowhere, it seemed, and play this crazy sick peak, and to the point where the phrase microjam became a household word for Phish fans. And then if you were there and you were kind of experiencing it and marinating with it with the band in person, it meant a lot more to you than if you were at home on your couch doing whatever you were doing. And then all of a sudden it got exciting. There was a big disconnect I felt this summer between those at home and those in person.
I totally agree. And in fact, on the New Year's run this year, I met Megan, who, podcasts about Phish a bunch. I had never met her before. And we talked about that, where I said, it's kind of hard to give a review from the couch on a run. And again, none of us are lucky to go to all these shows. But yeah, I think there's definitely something different about being in person. And frankly, I would say there are some times when you're in person and you leave the show and you're just super excited because you were there, and maybe you're over exuberant just because you were at the show, right? It's just something you're pumped up for. You had a great night, maybe something, I think that's part of the communal experience of any of these things, whether it's Phish shows or other art that you're just enjoying as a group.
Well, sure. I mean, that's the bread and butter of this whole podcast, right? I mean, that's the whole point, that being at a show can lend itself, and the experience is more special than the souvenir of the show itself being the recording. But I felt like in the summer of 2019 specifically, there was like a greater gulf than ever before in the experience between those listening and those in attendance. But let me ask you, Chris, in the summer of 2019, who were you and where were you at that point of your life that led you to this Alpine Valley show?
Had two young kids, and honestly, getting away for a full weekend to see Phish at Alpine Valley, because that's usually where we would catch them in the summer. I mean, their traditional stops were Chicago or Alpine Valley when they came through the Midwest. I don't know that they've ever done both in a run. It was just one of those things where my buddy that I see almost all the Phish shows with, Mark, which feels weird to call him Mark, is his nickname Shug. So whenever I don't say someone's nickname, it feels odd. We had planned to go to all three shows. And he had actually just moved to the burbs recent-ish of that. And so I had to figure a different way home on that Sunday night. So I actually made a plan with my buddy who turned 40 and was the reason I got to go to the New Year's run this year, so that we were going to meet up and then ride home together. So the three of us, him, meaning Brian, who is, if we're going to keep the nicknames going, is Dr. Sir Sporting Hercules, which is kind of a mouthful. So we usually in text it's DSSH, right? And then his cousin, Brandon, we were going to ride home together for that show. So it was funny. We were actually making plans for before and after the show, what we were going to do. So before, we actually played a ton of golf. So I think Phish could have done anything that night. And we were, had just had a great day outside. We played 18 regular at a course. And then we played a short course, 18, where we kicked our shoes off and walked around barefoot, and on, we had a couple beers and we're having fun. But honestly, the like anticipation, it was almost as if it was like kind of growing, right? We were going to go to the show that night. And again, we didn't know we were going to get what we were going to get that night. But the adage of you never miss a Sunday show, I mean, it sure worked out for the show we're going to talk about.
Is that why you have attendance bias toward this show? Because of the group, because of the day that led up to it? Or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, I mean, Alpine Valley is a pretty special place for me. I mean, I think it'd be hard for me not to pick Alpine Valley. I mean, I'm from Wisconsin originally, or I love to say I was born and raised inside the Cheddar Curtain. So, that's kind of my favorite venue. And I think the sound there is actually great. I mean, I'm probably biased on attendance bias here. Alpine Valley is just where I've seen, most of my concerts. So I think it would always have to be there, but for sure the group having fun, the excitement leading up to it. And then, them just put together one of those bangers of a show.
Set 1.
They opened set 1 with The Landlady, and my first note was, this will get your attention. It took me a long time. I think it was Mexico 2020 before I saw them play The Landlady as a standalone song after listening to so many tapes from 1991 and 1992 before it morphed into Punch You in the Eye. This one is the first one since July 10th, 2016 in Syracuse, where it was also a show opener. And my first thought listening to this song as a whole is that it sounds very laid back. They're not exactly hitting every single change exactly right. The band sounds very loose in this show, and I think that is apparent in the Landlady opener.
Totally agree.
And then at the end of it, Trey says he likes to start every show with a dance lesson. I wasn't there. So what was that about?
Yeah, I mean, they were dancing around on stage and just sort of having fun, right? I mean, I think that opener, and maybe you could quibble with how well it was played or something like that, but it just seemed like we were all there for a Sunday night and we were going to have fun, and Phish was having fun, right? Like just their interaction, even coming out, joking around a little bit, told you that, yeah, they were ready for, being maybe a little bit sillier than even usual that night.
Yeah, that comes across. Silly is a better word than loose, I think. I agree with you there. Because Phish, in my opinion, they made their bones about being so exact and so unique and so tight. But 3.0 Phish, in a show like this, especially when they're joking, they might miss a change or something here or there. It reminds me of when your straight edge friend, or maybe even your friend's parents, who are usually straight edge and very normal, they might get a little tipsy one night when your parents have them over, and you see them loosen up a bit and joke around. They're not as straight edge and 90-degree angles as they usually are. That's what this whole show had, that vibe for me. It sounded like a party more than like a concentrated musical performance.
Totally agreed. And sometimes, I feel like all these cliches hold, but I have a coworker who always says, let's not let perfect be the enemy of good. And I almost think that should be changed sometimes for Phish, where it's like, let's not let perfect be the enemy of great or fun, right? Because, there are certain songs that I think if they don't hit it exactly how the notes go, then maybe you're a little bit disappointed. They're putting their best out there and they're just trying to have fun. And in a weird way, sometimes it not being perfect to start, it might be a good thing, right? But, maybe it just relaxes them, relaxes the band, relaxes the group, because I kind of think it's one of those things where, nobody wants to talk to somebody if they have a perfect game going, right? Or they're throwing a no-hitter, right? So it's like, well, we can't talk about this, right? And maybe it's a little bit overblown to say that, but yeah.
No, because I've been to shows that feel like a no-hitter. I've been to shows where one that comes to mind, and I mentioned this on the podcast before, I think it was the third night in 2016 that the band played in San Francisco. The first set was filled with rarities, much like this show. And it was like after every song they played that it was the first time since and busted out after this many shows. It was like a pitcher throwing a no-hitter. Like, don't play a normal, regular song that we've seen 1,000 times. Don't play Yarmouth Road here, right? Don't play AC/DC Bag. And that's not a slam on either of those songs, but it's like, let's keep this no-hitter going. Let's not break the groove. And that came to mind here because they opened with The Landlady, which was the first time since 2016. And then, wow, they play Olivia's Pool, which is the first one since November 17th, 1997 on Phish.net. It says 694 shows. That is, did you know what was going on? Did you know this song?
So I wasn't sure I know this song. I knew this song. Sorry. It was one of those where you do look back after and you go, man, this was 6 years before I ever even saw Phish live. Right. So it was one of those things that really resonated with me, right? That it was that long ago that it had been. And, I don't know what the longest streaks are, right? I'm sure there's something out there. I haven't researched that, but it feels like it's got to be one of the longer streaks that was broken.
Yeah, I have to imagine. I mean, I don't know where it falls. I don't have that kind of memory. I'd have to talk to Zizix to figure that one out. I mean, some of the biggest bust outs that come to mind for me is they played Skin It Back at Jones Beach in, I think, 2012, which was like the first time since, I don't know, maybe like 1987 or 1988. It was a really long gap. But I can imagine looking around how many people in the audience knew it, Olivia's Pool, that is, as Shafty from The Story of the Ghost. But it's fabulous. It's straightforward. And like you said earlier, it's easy going. There's a blues piano solo that's fabulous, but it's an easy song to warm up with, even though it's special for being a rarity.
And do you think maybe this is kind of a sidebar, but do you think they put full set lists together before shows and they know what they're going to play? I mean, is that your belief, or hard to say?
I think for a show like this, they do.
Okay.
I think for a show like this, they kind of have to. I mean, these are songs we just said. What was the statistic? 94 songs. You can't just decide to play that.
Yeah. So they must have been practicing it leading up to it, right? And they knew they were going to drop in a few of them. Yeah. And I asked that because I do wonder, it seems like sometimes if shows are going great, maybe they drop something in the second set that they hadn't considered, right? But if it's early in the first set, I assume that's something that's been worked out ahead of time and they know they're going to get there.
Right. And we'll get to this later. I think like Ruby Waves, I think might have been off the top of Trey's head and it turned into what it turned into, the monster that it is. I don't think that was planned ahead, but something like The Landlady, Olivia's Pool, and then The Man Who Stepped Into Yesterday with the Venu Malkenu, that can't just be off the top of your head. You got to plan that stuff. This is also another bust out, The Man Who Stepped Into Yesterday. The first one since August 2015, 147 shows.
Obviously, when you're at the show, knowing that, or at least I shouldn't say obviously, I don't know the gaps of some of those songs, right? But a few of them do just strike you as, man, it might have been a while for this, right? So as you're reading through the notes, it's one of those things where it probably feels like, oh, this is great. This is something that I, didn't expect, or it's a bust out, like you said. And then when you go back to look at it, just confirms what you were thinking.
And I also noticed listening to this first set so far, just 3 or 4 songs in, there are very long pauses in between songs. It was very unusual because compared to today, and I mean literally 2023 or 2024, the band usually just melts one song before whoever starts up the next song. They don't usually have pauses. I don't want to say anymore, but in contemporary shows, they don't really pause that much between songs. But man, there are pauses of over a minute between songs in this first set.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that because I obviously listened back to the show a couple times before we, talked about it. But it was something at the time that you sort of felt it. And I was sort of wondering, like, you can read into it every different way, right? Are they thinking this through? Are they getting ready? But in a weird way, I feel like it was building a little bit of anticipation, right? Or it's almost giving you time to turn to the person next to you, because as a person that I like, I'm a talker, I guess, as maybe you can tell through the podcast so far. During the shows, I just like to be in the moment, enjoy it. We might say something at set breaks or whatever, and I'm not saying we, don't talk, but the breaks gave us a chance to kind of look and, figure out what was going on as each of these songs were going on. Like, is that what we heard? Is this what's going on? Which is almost made the enjoyment even higher.
I agree. The tension can build and the excitement can build. After the man who stepped into yesterday, they go into the meat stick just to let everyone know we're all here to have fun, because it gets all the love. I don't know anyone who doesn't really like when meat stick starts up. I don't know why everyone always treats it like it's a bust out or a huge favorite. Maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe it's just we all get fooled into thinking it's Fire on the Mountain for 30 seconds. Whatever it is, Meat Stick is a popular choice. Maybe it's the dance. It's a straightforward, fun version. And then they go into Vultures. And this is where I started having the feeling that, oh, this may be a capital S's special show.
Yeah. And I think there are sort of moments in songs where you feel like it's building, right? And there's a mix of anticipation, like you're saying, right? Just to go back quickly on the meat stick, like, is it in fact, is this what I think it is? You know what I mean? And then as it's sort of building, you realize, oh man, we're 6 songs in or 7 songs in, how many songs we are. And it's been great so far,
Yeah, it's
really good songs, good placement, some rarities, obviously, because they haven't been played in decades. So yeah.
And even the songs that aren't rarities, like Meat Stick and Vultures, which is next, they're all favorites. They're all fan favorites. Even if Vultures isn't, it's not like once every 600 shows or whatever. It's always fun to hear Vultures, because especially for me, the Fishman drum fills, I always love hearing him do that. I don't like that the woos come in at the end, and in my words on my notes, automatically ruins it. But there was some mushy guitar in here. So I thought so many of these songs were bust outs, and there's excitement and a tremendous amount of charm, but were they practiced? I don't know. Do you think set lists matter? Does it matter what they play as long as they're playing well, or as long as there's energy and excitement?
I mean, look, you always want to hear songs that you haven't heard before if you're a Phish fan, like maybe I am, or you are. But I actually don't think set lists matter as much. It's almost like, were they having fun? Were they playing well? Did we really enjoy these songs? I mean, how much are you dancing? So for sure, there are some songs that if you had seen a bunch or have been played recently, maybe you're a little bit disappointed about that. But yeah, I actually don't think it matters as much. How about you? What do you think?
I think that it depends on the show, and I agree with you. I think for a show like this, or at least a set like this to start, I think this is about the set list. This is about the songs that they're playing, because at least I know we talked earlier about how explicit Phish can be. I think they're really sending a message to the Alpine Valley audience. This is a special place for us, which it is. This is the end of the tour. We're excited to play all of these songs, which is a treat. Up next is Spock's Brain. Holy shit. I haven't heard that one yet, at least as far as I know. So they are actively treating the audience to an out of nowhere, a no-hitter set.
Yep.
And so to me, that's important. But then when you get to the second set and they play a 40-minute Ruby Waves, that is probably one of the jams of 3.0, one of the jams of the century. It doesn't matter, because who cares what song that jam came from?
Yeah, I wonder if playing rarities like that. So maybe I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth here, which maybe my wife would jokingly say is one of my fortes, but is that maybe when you do have a set list like that in your first set, then it frees you up to do whatever you want to, whatever you sort of feel coming, because you were talking about a show where it felt like they were pitching a no-hitter for the first set. In the end, ultimately, would you be disappointed if the second set was a bummer? I mean, I guess you'd be a little bit disappointed, but you always have that first set that was crazy, right?
Got to be grateful.
Yeah, that they hit all those songs that you were, didn't expect to hear when you showed up.
Yeah,
which is all part of the fun.
So I mentioned just in passing that they played Spock's Brain. I wonder how many people recognized it in the moment. Did you?
No, I don't think I recognize the moment.
Yeah, I imagine there were thousands and thousands of fans like you because it hasn't been played very much. Mike plays it on his solo tours occasionally, but this was like a full-on Phish version. I'll have to check the stats for the last time it was played. After Spock's Brain is Pebbles and Marbles with a very short intro, a very fast tempo, I should say. Trey, I thought, is speeding up the tempo, and the band sounds really cohesive about 7 minutes in. I thought this was, so far, we're a little bit more than halfway through the first set. I thought this was the best jam of the set so far. Like, I was loving this. A lot of power chords from Trey. And maybe this is why the soundboards don't translate as well as audience recordings for this summer tour. Because in this one, with the power chords, you could hear the energy from the stage kind of wash over the audience and the audience respond back. On the soundboard recordings, it's a little more sterile, in my opinion. And After Pebbles and Marbles is my favorite song ever, my favorite Phish song. It's always a great show if they play Glide. No matter what, when they play that when Fishman plays that hi-hat opening, I always go nuts. The guitar parts are a little iffy, but it holds together well enough. And at around 3:30, there's some weird messing up of the vocal harmonies. And Trey makes a joke saying that after the dancing lessons, we like to follow that up with a singing lesson. It was a very loose show, very silly show.
Yeah, no, and I think that's where, having been on my feet for most of the day, like I said, golfing ahead of time, you sort of feel like a little delirious, right? Because if I can, I'll try and go in the pit, which maybe it's a rarity, but and not like I'd be sitting down if I was in the seats anyways. But it's just one of those things where you're sort of up and excited and kind of looking around, over the moon about what's occurring. So why is Glide your favorite Phish song?
It's a whole story, but briefly, it was the first song. I don't know if it's the first Phish song I ever heard, but it was the first song that I heard that instantly clicked in my head. And I said, I got to hear more of whatever band is playing this. I didn't know Phish. I heard of them. I didn't know any of their music. I had never heard A Picture of Nectar, and I heard Glide, and whatever it was, there's something about the drum part, because even the opening hi-hat and cowbells is kind of complex to play. And then when you throw everything else in with the crazy big chord, it reminded me at the time that I was listening to it for the first time of Pinball Wizard, where there's like a softer acoustic guitar background, and then a big power chord comes and kind of disrupts the rhythm you've gotten used to. And so I was making a leap from The Who to Phish, and Glide just sold me. I was in for life once I heard that song.
Amazing. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's funny because you think you had heard The Who, when you were much younger, right? So it was something that you just always appreciated. Is that what helped make the transition or sort of pull you in with Phish?
I guess. I mean, this could go on for an hour, this part of the conversation, but I got into The Who when I was like 12 or 13. It was when Tommy first came on Broadway. And then I kind of they opened the door for me. They were my gateway to classic rock as a genre. And then when I was kind of spent on that, I had all my favorites. I was listening to like Jethro Tull B-sides at that point, like really scraping whatever other people hadn't heard, using Columbia House and getting all the albums of every band that I could for a penny. And then once I transitioned over to Phish, it wasn't that I left classic rock behind, but it was more like, oh, this is guys who grew up on the same music that I love, but they're adding their own original spin to it.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
And Afterglide, though, is probably the most recent song played on this at the show, is About to Run, because this tour, a set can't go by without Ghosts of the Forest making an appearance. And I'm not complaining, because this is my favorite song off that album.
Again, I guess words matter. Maybe sometimes words don't matter because Phish likes to goof around. I do wonder when they play something like About to Run, does that foreshadow that we're getting this crazy Ruby Waves in the second set? Or maybe I'm just reading into it too much, but it strikes me as they're excited or they're getting after something, or maybe they're just playing a Ghost of the Forest song so that they can tick it off.
I think it's more the latter. I think whatever's newest, I think they're always most excited to play. And it's not a coincidence that, aside from standbys like Tweezer, for example, I think that the best jams come from the newest songs. It was true in 2009. It was true in 1994. It's always true, in my opinion, that when Phish plays their their best jams, they almost always come from the newest songs, right? What was it in 2022 when Thread was played at Jones Beach and it became this like enormous monster that went on for like 20 something minutes? But this About to Run isn't a huge jam, but talk about classic rock. This is a heavy guitar rock and roll song.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a good tune, and when people go to I think for other bands, they might play their entire album right at the show that they go to, their new album, because that's what they just put out. But it does feel like sometimes they're just putting these songs in to sort of feel where they can maybe jam with it more. And great point you made by saying that the newer songs are what they end up jamming out.
I think they're just most excited to play them. I think they're proud of them, and I think they're excited to show, or find out more likely, this is what can be done with this song. But with About to Run, I think it's straight guitar, Jimi Hendrix, finger tap, go nuts, and have the band play their classic rock roots. But the old standby ballad after a rager to kind of soften the landing space for About to Run is Strange Design. And Page is outstanding during this. Beautiful, both on the piano and harmonies, vocal harmonies, that is, before they have a very quick run through of Timber Ho.
Yeah, and I really like Strange Design. I don't know if it's just because it's a straightforward song that has good harmonies, and I'm not sure, it was probably 5 minutes, right? I mean, it's usually 4 or 5 minute song, but a great tune, and then into, like you said, a quick Timber Ho.
And they get ready to close the set. They sing I Didn't Know, which is another landing spot, although I could understand if they ended the set after Timber Ho. I was surprised it went on before they do close the set with the Reliable Rocker. One of their oldest covers is Good Times, Bad Times. And this is a long set. I listened to this show 2 or 3 times before we spoke, and I always it took me a while. Like, each set is about an hour and a half. The second set is an hour and 40 minutes.
Yeah, and it almost makes sense, obviously, with a almost 40-minute jam, that the second set would be longer, right? But the first set, we had that same feeling, as they wanted to break. I turned and thought, like, man, it almost like they were going to play only one set that night. I know they weren't, but it just felt like in a good way, a really long set.
Yeah,
for sure.
Well, a lot of mainstream bands, a lot of square shows, the headliner, they usually have two openers, and the headliner set is about 90 minutes. And you could say, oh, I saw this band and they played 90 minutes. You can't complain about that, an hour and a half of music. But Phish delivers that times two in one night with no opener.
Right.
So do you remember how it felt, like how you guys felt after that Good Times, Bad Times?
Yeah, I mean, just again, thought it was a really long set, and frankly, I don't. I try not to even look at my phone that much or wear a watch, whatever it is, right? Just sort of be in the moment and enjoy the show. But it was one of those things where I was actually trying to do the math of thinking, this was that 2 hours? Was that an hour and a half? So I mean, we were just talking about how there were a few songs, and that's where I think we started to figure out that there were some bust outs that hadn't been played in a long time. Because even people were sort of talking about different songs and almost trying to compare notes of like, is that what they played? Yeah, they played that song, right? Because when you have that many songs, I mean, the first concert I went to, the second set had like 5 songs, right? You can recall those songs. But when you go to a show and the first set is, I don't know, 12 or 15 songs, right? At some point, you're almost cataloging, like, did those get played? Did I just hear that? Which is always fun to do at the break.
Hi, everybody. Brian here to welcome you to the set break of today's episode of Attendance Bias. First, thank you for listening. And second, just a quick reminder to tell you that even though Attendance Bias comes to you for free, it does take a lot of work and it does take quite a bit of money to keep the lights on here at production. So I just wanted to ask a small favor if you could support the podcast in any number of the following ways. If you could leave a review or a rating of it on whichever podcast app you use. If you could spread the word, telling a friend or someone you think may be interested in it about it. Or probably the most concrete way is to go to www.buymeacoffee.com/attendancebias and donate however much you can financially to help with the continuing costs of Attendance Bias. So thank you again so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the second half of today's episode.
Set 2.
Set 2 starts with Mercury, and 2019 was a great year for Mercury. If this were 2024, I would anticipate a huge jam to open the second set. I think these days they're more likely to kind of, I don't know if dispense is the right word, but get through the composed section of a song and just open a whole set. They're not afraid. They're not waiting to find the right opportunity. They more seek out the jams now than let the jams come to them. I thought that Mercury would open it with a big set, and it didn't really. I mean, there were parts. The jam settles at about 9 minutes with maybe the opening of Bullfrog Neutron Tray for just a few seconds, and then it settles again at 11:30, and the song ends very soon after. This is where I think the phrase micro jam kind of comes from. Not this performance exactly, but it's emblematic of that idea.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, and then we'll get to the next song, obviously, in a little bit, but if you took a pause, you would almost think that these songs were together, right? Meaning, was Ruby Waves the long song? Like, it's one of those things where I think looking back, you might almost say, like, not that they jammed into it or it bled into the song, but there was so much jamming that came after that you almost wonder, was the opener actually a 40-minute song or a 50-minute song? It wasn't, but that's the feeling. Because you're right. And to open the second set, it's almost like you'd expect that to be where they drop just a mega jam.
Right. But we're only 11 minutes early or 11 minutes late because the headline of this show is the Ruby Waves. Mercury bleeds right into it. And if I may, take from my friends over at Phish.net, I'm going to read from their jam charts. This is their description of this Ruby Waves before you and I get into the highlights. Quote, an unflagging improvisational behemoth that moves from moody rocking out to a low simmering groove to a propulsive tray-led anthemic rush to swampy blissfulness to reggae, exclamation point, to motorized power riffing with a thrilling peak to ambient space to a surprising and welcome effects-laden gallop into the unknown to a breathless and ferocious finale and second ambient deep space segment for good measure with neither muss nor fuss. At the time of writing, the longest modern era jam and 7th longest ever to date, and not a second wasted on top. Listening to this masterpiece is non-negotiable. Chris, your thoughts?
Could you repeat what you just said? Can you?
I'm sorry, I wasn't listening. What?
Yeah. I don't know that I would ever put a description like that together, but man, there's you talked about being a teacher, and how would you diagram that sentence, right? How would you pull that apart? It's almost like the song itself needs that description because there was just so much encapsulated into it. I think the part that's interesting is not a second wasted on top, right? I do think there are some jams that end up going long, right? Where the criticism of it is, and criticism, in quotes, right? Is that maybe they're messing around a little bit or hanging out for some of the jam, right? Where they're intentionally taking it long. Whereas it actually doesn't feel like there's, fat on this, right? Like they're truly trying different things within Ruby Waves. And it feels like, yeah, just a sort of mega jam where I'm getting chills talking about it right now, right? Just that you were there and that's what you heard. And wow, it was 38 minutes long. Is that the total?
38 and change. Yeah.
Yeah.
And let's remember in context, because before this version, Ruby Waves, at least in my view, was kind of a setlist killer. It's got all the hallmarks of an easy to make fun of Phish song. It's got upbeat, cheesy lyrics from Trey that lack a little bit of poetry and are very on the nose, very spot on. A lot of major chords, very bouncy, and everyone makes fun of it. And then they're singing along with it by the time the 3rd or 4th chorus comes around.
I think this is a good example of you'd have to be a Phish fan for a while to appreciate this. I mean, I think if you went to your first Phish show and they played this, I'd be interested to talk to somebody that had not gone to a Phish show and then went and heard, a song like this. I'm guessing if they're into music, they would appreciate it, right? That just the sheer length of time and all the jams. But I do think you make a great point about how what was a setlist killer, they kind of flip it on its head, right? And they jam it out. And so I have all these positive memories of Ruby Waves, right? They played it on New Year's, right? Or was it the 30th or the 31st this year?
I don't remember. I'll check that in the fact check.
Yeah, I think they might have played it on the 31st quickly, and it's funny because then when you go hear a 38-minute version, right, you're like, oh yeah, they had a 8-minute or 7-minute version, right? That was the junior version of that song.
But I can remember, like, when Ruby Waves started up, people would start asking, oh, what's the name of this song? And then now when they started up, everyone gets excited, right? Because of this version, because this version opened the door of what could be,
right? For the longest time, I had not heard Simple, right? And which, again, easy song to pick, and I think I heard like maybe a 20-some minute version in Chicago, maybe 2013, 2014. But it was one of those things where it almost made it that much more memorable that I hadn't heard it. And I've, since heard it a number of times, and it's usually shorter. But it's funny because when you hear the long version, it almost piques those expectations of it's going to happen, right? Whereas conversely, I think Phish is just as happy to then play a 6 or 7 minute song. So it doesn't guarantee that you're then going to get a 38-minute song, which I enjoy, right? If you always knew, much like my silly joke about Tweezer Reprise or, Complaint, if you always knew how it was going to be, then it wouldn't be as special.
Right. Your not so controversial opinion.
Yeah. My not so controversial opinion.
But the jam, let's dig into it a little bit for this Ruby Waves. It starts with like a little low-key exploratory guitar because the band is still keeping the song going. Paige on piano is still leading the way. They get a little more forceful at about 5.5 minutes with a synthesizer. Paige brings in the synth, which was still kind of newish at the time. but I'm still not sure where it's going. And then oddly, by around 9 minutes, it dies down to almost nothing. It gets very quiet. And I think this is really the starting point, even though we're 9 minutes into the song.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's almost as if, to your point, what we talked about earlier, where they took some time between songs in the first set, where they took maybe a minute between songs and sort of let it calm down. Yeah, that was the feeling, right? That the song almost slows, not to a halt, right? But I mean, and then the jamming ensues from there, right?
Yeah, right. Not to a halt, to your point, right? They never stop, but they're kind of revving up because around 11 and a half minutes, there's very pleasant, upbeat jamming. Like I pictured myself there. Like I'd be kind of bouncing. I'd be really happy. I'd be smiling and nodding my head. I'd be really excited. But then 2 minutes later, all it takes is 2 minutes. At 13 and a half minutes, there is epic soaring guitar that does take the place over the rest of the band. It's not that different from the Tahoe Tweezer, in my opinion. There were shades of that at this point of the jam. They developed this brand new pattern, which is like a bed for Trey to solo over. Like they kind of develop. And then once they have that bed already there, now it's time for Trey to solo. He does it for 2 minutes and it dies down, or settles down, I should say, again at about 15 and a half minutes before the reggae section.
Yeah, and I think you could pick all different levels of complaints, right? That maybe Trey takes over, right? Or that he's forceful with his guitar sometimes. But I think this is a good example, right? Of where you really hear it, right? It's coming for you.
Yeah, well, every bus needs a driver.
Yep.
Because all those times where they're falling apart or dying down, if he didn't take over, it would stay dead, or it would probably have gone as effective as it became. So there's that reggae section near 20 minutes, and then it comes apart again at 24 minutes and 30 seconds. And when I was listening to this, I almost never do this, but I glanced at the clock and I realized there's another 14 minutes. And I thought, but they're on like their third valley here. They've already peaked 3 times. No, so it goes for another 14 minutes, and then when we're almost a half hour in, it gets a huge cheer from the crowd because it's descending into like cymbal washes and synthesizer noises. And it must be over this time, right? I mean, I wonder if that's why everyone was cheering at that part, at like 27 minutes. Did everyone think it was over? Because it wasn't. They still had another 9 or 10 minutes to go.
I don't know if it's just me, but the reason why I jumped in earlier is that if they play a reggae section, maybe it's just because I heard one of my first Phish shows, we heard Makasuba Policeman. I just assume that they're going to like transition into that song. I do wonder when the crowd was cheering did they think the song was over or did they think they were transitioning to something different? Because sometimes when you're just caught in a big jam like this, you kind of don't know, where you are physically, but you're not sure where it's going and you're just trying to enjoy it. Right. And give, the band love, right, to say thank you for what they're doing. So I think you're right. It's almost as if people thought the song might be over and not sure how it could still be going on at almost 30 minutes into the song.
And it does at 29 minutes. This is my favorite part of the whole jam. I could tell because I stopped taking notes after it. I wrote at 29 minutes that there's a new segment of furious strumming from Trey and rhythmic pacing from Mike. Like there's a lot of muted strumming from Trey. He's just playing rhythm right now with a lot of psychedelic stuff a little bit after 31 minutes. That is my favorite part. I could hear it right now in the back of my head. And then by 34 minutes, this is the stuff that legendary Phish jams are made of. Like this is what, and it's at the end. Normally, you could remember the fun stuff in the beginning or the middle, but it's so fun that they close as strong as they started.
Yeah, it again, you almost feel like somewhat lost in a good way, right? Where you're, normally if you get lost when you're driving, you're thinking, I can't get back to where I'm trying to get back to. But yeah, the crowd's going crazy, and it's a hard part because it's like building, 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 right? And you don't even know how to react to it. Whereas some of the, like we talked about Fluffhead earlier, right? You know the cadence of that song, so even if they're jamming it out, you kind of know how the excitement's building. Whereas here, you have no clue how the excitement's building, other than you're just enjoying it and quickly realizing that maybe you've heard one of the longest songs they've ever played live.
But we do come to an end of Ruby Waves eventually, and they land in Twist. Like, what can follow that Ruby Waves? It's kind of a thankless position. Twist doesn't really go anywhere interesting, but who cares? Most people at this time are probably just mind blown or chatting about Ruby Waves, or maybe even going to the bathroom because you couldn't for 40 minutes.
Yeah, it is a funny guess, right? Any song could be played after that, right? Because you've now heard an all timer. As sort of a joke, what would be the worst song they could drop in there? Is there a bad song at that point? I don't know.
Friday.
Friday and a Sunday.
Right. And then after Twist, which doesn't particularly go anywhere interesting, they play another fan favorite. It's like the first set is making a comeback for a little bit, where they play Swept Away and Steep. Typical versions, but Ruby Waves needs kind of two cool downs. Right? Twist is one, Swept Away and Steep is another one, which also, I don't want to ignore, there's a beautiful piano solo from Page during Steep.
Maybe it's me being, sort of retroactively nostalgic because my daughter's gotten into piano playing and she's super excited about it and really enjoying it. And I'm having fun. Like when I work from home, I haven't been in the office today, but when I work from home, the electric piano that she plays on is sort of right next to me. And I totally enjoy it. And I jokingly say to her whenever we talk about Phish, I mentioned Page and I almost retroactively, it seems odd to say, enjoy some of the Page moments even more. And maybe that's just like a cheesy dad thing, which I'm, fully admit to being. But yeah, that's a very good example of a solo from Page here.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing about great music and art in general, where the art doesn't change, right? The notes and the way that Page played hadn't changed, but the listener changes. You changed, right? Your daughter got into the piano. So now you listen to it with different ears than you did in 2019. The music hasn't changed. It's you. So it is cheesy. It is a cheesy dad thing to say, but it's a wholesome, awesome, cheesy dad thing to say.
And I'm realizing now, I'm horrible with remembering names, which is why I think I always go with nicknames. I think it's a crutch for me. I'm realizing, I think when I was explaining to my kids, I said my daughter was born in 2016. She was born in 2017 for my wife, so she'll appreciate the. I know you do a sort of check at the end, right? You what do you call the end of the podcast? Where you fact check? Yeah, so a little in podcast fact check that I remembered. But we talked about when we started before we started recording, we talked about posters, and it's funny, in the area where my daughter plays, I've been super thoughtful about what to put up there, because when Trey played the Beacon Jams, and it's a quick, side tangent, but just very fast. She would sit on my lap, and at the time, so she, 3 or 4 years old, right? Very young. And, it's good music. or I think it's good music, but I was surprised how much she would look forward to that. Because would they be on Fridays, or were they on
Tuesdays or something? I don't remember. I think it
yeah,
was Tuesdays.
it's sort of a flat circle of what time was. But she would sit on my lap and we would watch, at our kitchen table, which is where I was working at the time, right? Because we weren't going into offices. And I just have those like positive memories, right? Of just that was happening. And whenever she sees the postered out the Beacon Jam, she's like, oh, that's Trey. And I'm like, and Paige, right? He plays piano. She's like, yeah. So they're always fun.
After Swept Away and Steep, they played Death Don't Hurt Very Long, which is an interesting standalone version. I'm always used to it being segued into from something else. So I think this was also, I know that it debuted, I think it was 2017 or 2018 when when Cast Out Vaxxed Up was debuted. But I always see this as a very awkward way to start. But man, vocally, they are really livening things up by just shouting and playing with the different ways to say this phrase, Death Don't Hurt Very Long. Pretty much not the only lyrics, but the refrain of this song. They had a lot of good time, and no better time than following up, God damn it, with an Iculus.
And I do remember when I got back from this show, a buddy of mine who's a Phish fan and wasn't able to go to the show, he didn't even bring up the Ruby Waves. He's like, you saw Iculus? He's like, that's not fair, man. He's like, I've never caught an Iculus. He was super jealous of it, and they were having fun with it, where talking about drooling and just getting silly in the song.
What was that about? Because it sounds very spontaneous to start with, and this is a song for as big a rarity and as revered as it is. All they need is 3 chords, and Trey to have something to say. But I think it's Trey who says it's not every show that you start drooling, and then he talks about how it's been a fun summer, and after the show they'll go to their separate rooms and drool. So what do you remember? Was Trey drooling? Was it during a Ruby Waves jam?
Maybe that's what was happening, right? Because maybe Trey was drooling and he was giving a reference back. I honestly wish I knew. I don't know.
To me, as far back as Vultures in the first set, I was thinking, oh, this could be a special show. And it pretty much was. And then they played Ruby Waves and knocked it out of the park. Swept Away and Steep, another fun rarity, or at least lesser heard song. And then Iculus is like the anointing of it. Like it's been knighted as a special show.
And so that's the question of when they're picking out set lists, is that one where you think they land that Ruby Waves and then they decide they're dropping an Iculus into that into the show, or you think that was already prearranged?
I think Ruby Waves was spontaneous. I think the jam that came out of it was spontaneous. And then I think Trey is very, and all of them, I don't want to ascribe every single decision of what they play to him, but I think that they know they just played a monumental jam. They're obvious about it. I mean, this past year in Mexico, when they played a 45-minute Chalkdus torture, and then Trey joked the next night saying, oh, you ready for another 45-minute song? And they played Chalkdus torture reprise. They're aware of the effect of what they play has on the audience. So I think that after they play Ruby Waves, it's just like, this is a special show already. Let's just really go for the jugular and play Iculus. The fans are going to love it. We're going to have fun with it. And it's a throwback to the old school, just like the next 2 songs, Buffalo Bill, where we time travel to 1985, and then You Enjoy Myself. Like, what is this?
I was glad they played Buffalo Bill, only because my buddy that I mentioned, Shug, that I go to all these concerts with, we would always play Madden and pick teams, and so we would draft the teams and whatever, and before we had kids and had more free time. But whenever we would try and pick which franchise we were going to be, because we're Packers fans, right? So we could never do the NFC North, so we could never do Packer stuff. But we would commonly end up in the it would be the AFC East. And we would want to play the Buffalo Bills because when we play our games, we would put the song on like idiots, like, we're so clever. But it just has like, it's one of those things where it just has your own reason for thinking of whatever age you were at that time and how much you enjoyed it. So yeah, dropping it in here was great. And you can't complain if you hear you enjoy myself too.
Yeah. You Enjoy Myself was great. It was a big time, I thought would be a closer to an epic show for fun, if not for accuracy. A lot of flubs, but I'm sure a great time to be there. And then the drums drop out at about 10 and a half minutes and they play Catapult, where famously Trey tells the story of meeting a couple at the lobby of their hotel that a woman said that, or the I can't remember exactly, or the man of the couple said that he would propose to his girlfriend, or she said she would marry him if they sang Contact. And Trey said, I'm going to change the course of your lives right now.
To which none compare. But wait, Mike, there is gonna be a wedding. Do you wanna know why? No kidding. Because when I was in the lobby of the hotel yesterday, I met a lovely couple. This is completely true. And the woman was saying to me that she has been waiting to be asked by her boyfriend to marry her. And she said she would only say yes if you sang Contact on Sunday night at Alpine Valley, in which case, actually he said to me that he would then ask his girlfriend to marry him. So I've now just put the pressure on them. We will now sing Contact, and wherever the two of you are out there, you are now getting married. And these are all the people that heard this. So I've just changed the course of your entire life. Let's pause for a minute and play Contact.
And Mike starts up Contact, which is probably the most meaningful version ever.
Yeah. And I think maybe this is as we all sort of age and get wiser or whatever, it seems like Phish is like happy to give the fans what they want in some ways. Whereas I think,
you think after New Year's Eve?
Yeah. Whereas I feel like a lot of times it was like we're holding out on something, or there's always like another hill that they can climb, or another mountain, right? I guess if we're going to talk about New Year's Eve, but whereas they're catering to their fans, and I've met Trey once, and it was actually the short version of it was in 2004, so maybe not the best time for Trey. And we had this sort of silly business where we would go get newspapers after big events. We'd frame them and sell them, right? So I'm up in like the middle of the night between when they're playing at Deer Creek and Alpine. I forget which way they were going. I'm going to, and this is like 2004. So I'm walking sort of like newspaper stand to newspaper stand, buying these newspapers, pulling them out. And I see Trey coming from like, I don't know, 30 feet away, and it's dark, right? Like I'm shocked that Trey's even walking there. He sort of mumbled something to me, and I realized maybe things weren't going great at that exact time. But he did ask. He's like, "So what would you hope to hear tonight?" And I honestly wish I could remember what I told him. And the story goes so much better if I say I told him I wanted to hear Mike Super Policeman, and he played that. I'm pretty sure the song was played, but I'm also almost positive that Trey might not have remembered that interaction anyway. So it could have just been dumb luck. But that was my one time meeting Trey.
That's fun. God.
Yeah, and I sort of thought of it when he said he ran into this couple at the hotel lobby. I'm guessing it was he was in a better spot then, and remember that interaction, and was probably thoughtful to say, hey, if we're going to wrap this up, this is a good one to wrap up, because there's then they play back into You Enjoy Myself to finish the second set.
Yep, they did the bass and drums part into the vocal jam at the end of You Enjoy Myself, and the encore was More, and of course, Tweezer Reprise. For me, More was still getting its bearings, like it was growing on me. It's a good choice here. It's hard to complain about anything at this point. And Tweezer Reprise closed the Tweezer from the Friday night, from night one.
Yeah, and I have some affinity for More. I think it's a good song. I mean, I think it's almost just the upbeat of like, yeah, you want more of this, right? I mean, it's explicit. we'll take more of these shows if we could get them, and honestly, we'll take even half of what this sort of crazy show that we talked about was, because I think that's them also saying we're sort of out there giving it to you, right, as the band.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time today to going all the way through the ins and outs. And there's a lot here. We could have probably easily spent another hour talking about July 14th, 2019 at Alpine Valley in Wisconsin. Rarities, huge gems, fan favorites, throwbacks to 1985. Couldn't get any deeper. Thank you so much for taking the time to bringing us back and kind of having us join in the group with your friends, having such a good time for this show. Were you on the lawn or were you in the reserve seats?
No, we were in the reserve seats, and you know, I really appreciate the chance to talk about it. But at the end of the show, I did have a great one when you bring up the lawn, because Alpine's lawn is vertical. And it's big. So much so that when we put in for tickets, you kind of always get lawn seats. The closer, the better for me. But I do remember we were going to meet on my buddies to go home. Brandon and Brian are doctors for Sporting Hercules, if we're going to get it out one last time, at the top of the lawn. And the Mockingbird Foundation had a little tent set up, and they had these cows on the posters. And I loved it. And a guy made a donation and took whatever the last 10 posters they had. And I was like, oh man, what a bummer. You know, like one more. And he turned to me and he's like, we're never going to forget tonight. And he peeled off one of the posters and gave it to me. And so it's, you know, one of those that I, you know, hung up and love, right? Because it was like, yeah, this is in, you know, the state of Wisconsin, right? So inside the Cheddar Curtain where I'm from, I see this all-time show. Just always remember, you know, just the kindness too of fans that are like, yeah, I'm sure he got a bunch for his friends and he didn't know who I was, right? I don't even think he asked my name, but peeled it off. And we just walked to the car, like smiling and trying to sort of like piece back together. And I forget if it was Brandon, maybe said, he's like, was that the longest Mercury or Ruby Waves ever, right? It was one of those things where we were still just like working backwards through the show, piecing it together. So yeah, it was a total pleasure to get a chance to chop it up with you on this. Thank you.
And that's it for today's episode with Chris Bojar. And we really were all over the place at some point, so we have to double check a lot of stuff with today's attendance bias fact check.
Attendance bias fact check.
While Chris's first Phish show hasn't yet been covered on attendance bias, I did record a mini episode about Down with Disease from the first night of that Cincinnati run. That would be February 21st, 2003 at the US Bank Arena in Cincinnati. Chris mentions that he met Megan, who podcasts about Phish, at this past New Year's Eve run. He is referring to a good friend of this podcast, Megan Gliona, who is a co-host of the Helping Friendly podcast, which I recommend for any nerdy Phish fan. The biggest Phish bust out, according to Phish.net, was Fuck Your Face, which went 1,426 shows between performances from April 29th, 1987 to July 2nd, 2010. My guess, off the top of my head, of Skin It Back was close though. That was the second biggest bust out, at 1,424 shows between performances. That went from July 29th, 1988 to July 3rd, 2012 at Jones Beach. Regarding Spock's Brain, I have not yet heard it live, and the time it was played before this show at Alpine Valley was February 21st, 2019 in Mexico. It has not been played since this show at Alpine. I mistakenly said that in 2002, there was a monster version of Thread played at Jones Beach. I was wrong because I was actually thinking of Leaves from July 26, 2022. Highly recommended listening as a pinnacle jam from that summer. For the record, Ruby Waves was played during the first set of New Year's Eve on December 31st, 2023. The version of Simple from Chicago that Chris mentioned was played on July 15th, 2017. It contains an incredible jam that is often overlooked due to the soon-to-be-played Baker's Dozen. Check it out if you haven't yet heard it. Man, 2020 seems like 100 years ago, but for the record, the Beacon Jams were played on Thursday nights. And also, since time is a flat circle, I had to be reminded that the Casvat Vax Halloween show was in 2018, not 2017. And that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Chris Bojar for joining me today, Phish.net for its help with the fact check, the Mockingbird Foundation for everything they do for children's music education, and Phish.in for the recording used in today's episode. If you enjoy Attendance Bias, please support the show by visiting www.buymeacoffee.com/attendance bias and donating anything you can. You can also follow Attendance Bias on social media. Thank you again so much for listening, and I'll see you next week on Attendance Bias.